This is Mary Massey with Heroes and Patriots. I am joined by remote with John Goodiron. Let me tell you about our underwriting. Dr. Richard Phillips with the Ukiah Dental Center, located at 307 Luce Avenue in Ukiah. Visit his website at ukiahdental.com. Dunlap Roofing, roofing and gutter services with offices in Fort Bragg, Ukiah, and Willits. Visit their website at dunlaproofing.com. Fry Vineyards and Winery, located in Redwood Valley, America's first organic winery. Great local wines with no added sulfites, produced biodynamically. They are on the web at frywine.com. Underwriting is also provided by Ore Hot Springs, a natural hot springs and retreat located between Mendocino and Ukiah. Reservations are required. Please call 707-462-6277 or make your reservations on the website at orehotsprings.org. Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today we will be talking about the Freedom of Information Act with our guest Ken Klippenstein. But first, let me welcome John remotely to the program.
Hello, Mary. Thank you for taking the extra step to patch me in from Falls Church, Virginia.
Absolutely. So today we are speaking specifically about what it means to have the Freedom of Information Act. It was established, or reestablished, I should say, or expanded in 1966 by President Lyndon Johnson, which was then enacted in 1967. It gives public access to almost any federal government record that the FOIA itself does not specifically exempt from disclosure. The central purpose of the FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act, is to ensure that the government's activities are open to the sharp eye of public scrutiny. Hence, the basic purpose of the FOIA is to open agency action to order the release of improperly withheld or redacted information. So today we are welcoming for the first time Mr. Ken Klippenstein. Ken, are you with us?
I sure am. Thanks for having me.
Great. And we will adjust volume if everyone is able to hear us or not, so just let us know. I'd like to start out with shadowproof, which is an interesting concept. You are offering what to that organization in your capacity?
Well, you were talking a bit about the Freedom of Information Act, which we call FOIA for short, and I'm kind of their FOIA guy. I file a lot of open records requests to try to get insight into what government's doing, in our name and with their tax dollars that they won't release on their own, but you have to request and then they will release.
And it's my understanding, is there a repository right now that exists of these kinds of documents that you personally have been collecting in your journalistic efforts?
Yes, that's right. On Shadowproof, we post a lot of them. Unfortunately, I think that the Freedom of Information Act is a bit of a misnomer in that what we have is the freedom to request those documents. I think a better way to do it would be to just post them all so that you don't have to ask for them and then wait a certain period of time. But unfortunately, that's the situation we're at. Mm-hmm. So that's what I try to do, is request as much as I can and then post it all so the public can kind of go through it and come to their own conclusions.
And are you saying there is such a repository of these documents, or is this newly formed, newly created, available to the public now?
You have to ask for them. There's no place that they put these. I just asked for emails that were being sent, since I suppose that these officials are probably communicating with each other. But unfortunately, no, there is no such suppository where they place all these things. It would be nice if they did, though.
So this is a new endeavor by Shadowproof to collect all of the emails and information that you have received from your investigations through the Freedom of Information Act and is available to the public. Am I
Yes,
following
that's correct.
it? Okay.
For people to kind of go through there, and I think this is a good model because then you don't have to depend on the journalists' conclusions about records. You can actually look at them yourselves and come to your own conclusion.
Now, this is a federal act. Is there also a Freedom of Information Act on the state level, or what?
Yes, that's correct. So each state has its own sort of interpretation of the Freedom of Information Act. That's the federal level, the Freedom of Information Act. But every state has something, and they'll name it something different. Maybe the Sunshine Law of California, or the Open Records Law, but the idea behind it is essentially the same. And of course, the state legislatures draft these things, so they all vary to different extents, but the spirit of it is supposed to be roughly the same as FOIA.
I see. And you, at your website, I know you're contracted with Shadowproof. You're dealing, I guess, only specifically with the federal, or do you also address state issues?
Oh, both. I do both. What's interesting about state is they tend to reply quicker, since I think that the bureaucracy tends to be less at the state level. However, at the federal level, things are very important. You know, these are matters of foreign policy, national security, and perhaps as a consequence of that, you just have to wait a lot longer for records at the federal level. So yeah, I do both. You do find quicker turnaround at the state and local level than at the federal, but I'm not saying that the federal isn't extremely useful. You just have to wait a little bit longer.
And when the Freedom of Information Act was created, there was an appeals guide or 9 exemptions that were put in place. How often do you bump up against these exemptions?
Oh, constantly. And certainly sometimes they're justified. For instance, there are certain things of national security importance that you don't want the nuclear codes and out and things like that. But also very often I'll find these exemptions are abused, particularly at the federal level, but also at the state level. Mm-hmm. Because if they withhold something, unless you have a strong third party, which some states do have laws where a third party looks over these things and kind of says if it's legitimate or not for them to withhold records. But very often, if you don't have that third party, you don't know if it's reasonable for them to withhold certain records or redact them, since you can't actually see what they are. So that is something they'll abuse. Right.
And so you're saying you bump up against this pretty often?
Oh, all the time, constantly.
You say on your the information that's reported on shadowproof.com, which is the website I'm referring to, you say that you are able to publish previously unreported documents on FBI investigations on arms monitoring groups and even musicians, as well as how officials handled the white supremacist rally recently in Virginia. Can you speak specifically on what kinds of investigations we're talking about when it comes to arms monitoring?
Well, the story you're referring to, I found that the FBI had kind of surveilled a very prestigious arms monitoring firm called the Stockholm Institute for Peace and Research. And what they did was they tried to make a case that, what SIPRI for short, the Stockholm Institute, what they do, they're an arms monitoring group that sort of goes around, reports on what different weapon systems different countries have, with the goal being that then the global international public can kind of know, what these weapon systems are, how we can apply international law to prevent, potentially a crisis, whether it's at the nuclear level or with other armaments, and really enforce mechanisms to prevent, for example, illegal weapons like cluster bombs and things like that from being used. Mm-hmm. So it's very standard for them. They'll ask governments, what is this weapon system? What information can you provide us with it? And then they'll report it just for the public to kind of think, this state now has these weapons. How will we incorporate that into international law? Right. However, the FBI tried to make a case that by simply asking governments to voluntarily disclose information about these weapon systems, that they were engaging in espionage. And so they conducted a counterintelligence investigation, which is the kind of thing you usually see done on foreign adversaries like Russia, for instance.
You're saying the FBI,
they did that against this.
The FBI did the counterintelligence.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, go ahead.
Against this frankly very prestigious arms group. I mean, this wasn't a fringe kind of activist group by any means. This is something that's very respected and is constantly cited by the United Nations, by various rights groups. So it appears they didn't end up following through with that, but the fear is that could have a chilling effect on other arms groups, seeing that they try to build a case and thinking, well, gee, maybe we don't want to get into legal problems with the FBI. Maybe we'll stop asking these things, which I think would be very injurious to the process of getting the public to know what weapons exist.
Right. And you're also investigating the new division in the FBI for the leaks that have occurred, are you not? Can you tell us about that?
Yep, that's correct. So under Sessions, they kind of announced a new counterintelligence division specifically for leaks, which it's important to note that there already was a dramatic escalation in the prosecution leakers to the press under the Obama administration. And so to expand that even further seems pretty concerning, in my opinion.
Right, right. What other kinds of things are you working on as it relates to the FBI?
Well, there's so much information that the Bureau collects that is just never entered into the public record simply because there just aren't a whole lot of people that are requesting these records. For instance, I'll ask very often for heads of state, particularly from despotic regimes, and when I get their FBI files back, it's not uncommon that I'll find that no one else had requested those and it hadn't been previously reported. And so this is a tool that I would hope over time, not just the general public, but especially journalists would start to use more, which unfortunately they don't, just because the time frame it takes to hear back, perhaps a year or so, is too great for them to invest that.
It doesn't
time
seem very
and energy
current, I guess, at that point.
Right.
Can you remind me what the name of the group is, the Stockholm group, again?
It's the abbreviation is SIPRI, SIPRI.
Okay. And
I have a question about that, Mary.
oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So is this connected? Hi, Ken. Thank you for being on the show. This is John. Is this group connected to the Peace Institute?
I don't know if there's a connection there. I'm sorry, I'm not aware.
Okay. Because that was also targeted by the FBI for arms monitoring as an espionage investigation.
Interesting. I mean, yeah, really, it's hard to exaggerate how many places they're snooping around in. Especially, this was during the '80s when the fear of the Russians was really great, and so you could use that to justify a lot of things that were pretty flagrant violations of civil liberties and things like that.
Yeah,
so that wouldn't surprise me at all.
So I just wanted to make our listeners aware of that because this is something I routinely do in my company is to monitor money laundering and terrorist financing for the U.S. Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. But one of the things that we stumbled on, and I probably believe that these are in Freedom of Information request documents, is that the FBI's San Diego office division, and this was a direct report to the director of the FBI, had been monitoring a number of groups as well, including SIPRI. After the group had sent out a generic questionnaire related to arms manufacturers. The questionnaire inquired about the characteristics of a missile that the arms manufacturer was developing, and for their trouble, that organization ended up on the FBI's watch list.
Yeah, it was interesting. I interviewed the head of SIPRI, and he was just taken aback. He had never heard of it. They never notified him.
Okay.
That's what's so, I think, troubling about these kind of investigations is that there's very little transparency, and they don't notify the organization after the investigation.
Yeah, that's something that we found out again, that SIPRI had never been informed of the investigation or what the FBI's investigation concluded, and that's where the bugaboo is. I mean, you wonder after you've been investigated, are we still the subject of an ongoing investigation, or are the books closed on it, and can we move on with our lives?
Exactly. Yeah, there's no indication that it was ever closed, not that I could find in the records anyways.
Do you know how the FBI works with the CIA and the Intelligence and Threat Analysis Center, which used to be part of the U.S. Army Intelligence, how they coordinate these kinds of investigations?
Well, in this particular case, I can tell you how it worked. It looks like they were trying to collect information from the CIA and the DoD on this arms group, which is a degree of coordination for something that seems, on its face so harmless, that kind of astonished me.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about an investigation that goes back to, I'm guessing, about March of 1980. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, this is incredible. I'm looking at the documents now, the memoranda from the FBI office to SIPRI that triggered this, and again, in an investigation that started in 1980, SIPRI has never been informed as to whether the investigation is concluded. So you wonder, whether they're on watch lists, as SIPRI people, travel across the country, travel in and out of the United States, whether their tax records are subject to audit, this, that, and the other thing.
Right. What's particularly disconcerting, too, people might look at this and say, this is a historical artifact. This was a long time ago. The Russians were the big bugaboo then. We don't have to worry about this. But, I mean, look at the rhetoric around Russia right now. I don't think it's implausible to think that there could be something like another Cold War scenario, in which case perhaps they could try to revisit some of these things.
Exactly.
You mentioned the outcomes of wanting journalists to pick up on some of these stories. What has been the reaction to folks? Have you had much of that, or is there any kind of tangible benefit that we could hear about with respect to what you're, collecting these emails and so forth and getting it out there to the public?
I would say it varies greatly. It depends on if it fits the news cycle. Unfortunately, the media, much of it is a business at the end of the day, and so they have to get their clicks, they have to get their traffic and viewership. And the downside of that, in my opinion, is that when everything is profit driven, then you'll pursue stories that perhaps track with whatever the interests are of the day, and then you can overlook ones that still have great significance, but maybe aren't going to get the same raw number of views. For example, I recently did a story where I got a list of the gifts that President Trump was given by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia during his foreign visit there, his first foreign visit, actually. And that stimulated a huge amount of interest, and that's because it's about the sitting president, perhaps also because, he, during the campaign, ran on, standing up to the Saudis and having a much more aggressive public posture with regard to them, and obviously he's reneged on that.
Right.
But I still think it's an important story, but I think a large part of the reason it did well is because everyone wants to hear about Trump right now.
Right.
On the other hand, if I had reported something about the Obama administration or the Bush administration, I think there'd be much less interest in it, only by virtue of the fact that that's just not a hot story right now,
right.
even if it has, loads of historical significance. So that's sort of a downside, I think, of the kind of private media landscape we have today.
You stated that both state and federal, there's state and federal levels of FOIA or FOIA. How does that work when there's an overlap in jurisdiction? Or is there an overlap? Go ahead.
Yeah, that can certainly happen. I mean, there have been times when I've requested police records and there was an FBI involvement in the case, and then in that case they have to refer to the FBI and you have to go through them. So I would imagine the federal level generally trumps state level, but yeah, there are often questions like that.
Can you speak to?
I mean, every state handles it differently.
Yeah, sorry for talking over you. I think we have a bit of a delay. Can you speak to the records you got from the Chicago Police Department and its interactions with the DEA?
Oh, I just found that they were coordinating because the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, their thing is kind of following drug gangs and production around, and I figured in Chicago there was probably a great deal of it. I didn't get a whole lot of records back because DEA tends to be pretty secretive, but if you can find something at the state level, it tends to, in my experience, be a little more open and a lot more prompt in terms of getting records back. So I don't know that I found a whole lot of political significance, but it was interesting to see that level of coordination between a federal agency and just kind of ordinary beat cops.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about your information that you discovered about the Charlottesville event back in, I believe, August. You have an exchange of emails, and again, this is published on your shadowproof.com website. Can you talk about the email exchange between a professor there and the Charlottesville police and what happened?
Well, there's a professor at the University of Virginia, and he warned the police that, the day prior to when one of the, far-right, someone sympathetic to the far-right protesters ran over a woman and killed her. He warned the chief of police. He said, this is real dangerous. This isn't a joke. I was out there with some students to kind of see what was going on, and there were neo-Nazis. They were not just threatening violence but attacking people, and he just kind of gave them a heads up, saying, this might sound like just bread and circus, but it actually, I think, could turn very violent very quickly. And the police chief replied. I can't remember exactly what he said, but he did acknowledge that he got the message and everything. And basically the crux of the message was you need to send more police out here because there weren't enough to sort of like prevent violence from breaking out on the part of the far right demonstrators. And so the policemen acknowledged it, and then the next day, we all know what happened. The woman was killed.
Right. So this professor alerted them before the event of Saturday.
Exactly, because it went on for 2 days. The first day was a little smaller, and then the second day it really swelled. And this is exactly what the professor warned would happen.
Right. And the other thing that you've uncovered, I believe, is what the governor of Virginia was reporting. And in the media, I remember very specifically, he was saying that the local police were outgunned. And yet you uncovered some different information. Would you talk about that, please?
Oh, yeah. I don't want to be too sensational, but that's just ludicrous.
Go for it.
All these different state police, particularly Virginia, given its proximity to Washington, has what's called these DoD procurement programs, whereby they get literally military-grade weaponry and equipment from the Defense Department, surplus equipment, maybe stuff that they built and is more than what they need in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they'll literally have what are called MRAPs. I can't remember what it stands for, but they're basically like small tanks and Humvees and things. And so what I found was that they're a recipient under this program of all kind of wild weaponry. We're talking night vision goggles, assault rifles, the kinds you would see in the streets of Baghdad, tanks, literally missiles that you would launch tanks from. And this is just what they told us, because there's all kinds of things they can claim exemptions and not report. And in fact, Virginia is one of the less transparent in this regard, revealing what it has under this program. But that's just what we know. And so what we know is that they have pretty tough, military-grade hardware. So I think it's ludicrous for them to say that they were outgunned by, pretty scary neo-Nazis and hard-right individuals. But it's just hard to believe that these people who were perhaps carrying around handguns and things like that could outgun a police department that had literal military-grade weaponry.
And has there been any follow-up since you've discovered that they are recipients of militia-type equipment and so forth? Has there been any follow-up with, in the press or so forth, that this did in fact counteracts what the governor McAuliffe is saying?
Actually, the police even came out with a statement and said about the governor. They just kind of said, "Well, this isn't exactly accurate. I don't think we were outgunned." But the question is, if they were outgunned, it's because they didn't send anything there. They certainly had the equipment, and so you even have the police department saying, "Well, I don't know about that." And these are people that probably want more guns anyway. So when the police came out against the governor, I think everyone just kind of laughed because it's so outrageous.
So it's odd that the police was afforded these things, but they're saying they didn't have them. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the police said that the governor was wrong to say that they were outgunned. They said
okay, I see what you're saying.
Equipment.
Yeah. If you've just joined us, it's 24 minutes past the hour. We are speaking with first-time guest, journalist Ken Klippenstein. He is a writer for shadowproof.com, which is he is creating a repository of emails and other federal documents, state documents that under the the Freedom of Information Act. I'd like to turn the mic over to John now, if I might, because I believe he is with a question.
Sure. Ken, this is John again from Falls Church. And I'm kind of like a dog with a bone. I'm very tenacious about stuff, so I want to turn the discussion back to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. My tenacity kind of makes me very good at my job, but also makes me a royal pain in the ass sometimes. And I'm sure you're not you're not unfamiliar with the same observation, perhaps, in your own work.
Exactly.
But we're good at what we do. I do it more with algorithms and just sifting through deep data, that kind of thing, and data mining. So my question is, when we look at the FBI's investigation of SIPRI going back to 1980, it was with regard to something known as the Lance missile system, which is the United States' first transition from strategic nukes to tactical nukes. Now, what we've had since that time, and especially during the Obama administration, is a commitment of some $1 trillion over the next 20 years, both to modernize our nuclear arsenal and to miniaturize it. In other words, we're not looking at big strategic nukes that will take out, the entire city of Beijing or the entire city of Moscow, but we're looking, as Israel often does, in using a very dialed-down detonation radius blast, sometimes in the area of 5 to 10 kilotons, which is even smaller than the Hiroshima blast. And to modernize and miniaturize nukes to the tactical level, or to the level that's being used in the field, as opposed to submarine-based nukes or silo-based nukes in Montana or the Dakotas, what have you, in an effort to perhaps make them more palatable, to make their use more acceptable. And even retired members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have criticized the Obama administration in this shift towards tactical nukes as a way of making their deployment more acceptable. So in looking at the Lance missile, we see the United States first moving into small field-based tactical nukes. Now, the Lance missile system, which the FBI started to investigate CIPRI's curiosity about it, was replaced by something known as the ATAC-MS. And I don't mean to get too technical, but it's formerly known as the MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile System. And it's a surface-to-surface missile, or an SSM. It's manufactured by Lockheed. It has a range of about 100 miles with a solid propellant, and it's only 40 meters or 13 feet high, and about 610 meters or 24 inches in diameter, and it can be tipped with a small tactical nuclear missile. Almost certainly, these ATAC-MS missiles are strewn across the DMZ between South Korea and North Korea. And if Trump were ever to want to take out North Korea, I'm sure it will be done with these field tactical nuclear missiles instead of the big, ugly, dirty strategic nuclear missiles, which would no doubt bring Russia and China into a global war and the next Holocaust, the global Holocaust with the United States. Has CIPRI done any work in trying to get a fix on these new ATAC-MS missile systems, and have whether they're tipped with these small tactical dialed-down nuclear warheads, and whether they are in fact strewn across the DMZ with North Korea, and in fact whether that's what our plan, or what our war games plan is for North Korea should say they do a hydrogen bomb test over the Pacific, which they're now threatening to do. What do we know?
I don't know if CIPRI has, but what I do know is that there are many arms monitoring organizations that are raising a bunch of red flags over the danger that these tactical nukes pose. And what the general public doesn't understand, and is critical for them to understand for our own safety, is that these tactical nukes don't... what ends up happening is when a state possesses these, other state actors can very easily mistake other armaments for the use of these tactical nuclear weapons, and perhaps catastrophically respond in kind. So, for example, if we were to drop a certain kind of bomb, they could easily, knowing that we have all these tactical nukes, they could mistake those weapons for a tactical nuke, and then say, well, now we have to respond with a nuclear weapon. So for that reason, these are extremely dangerous and pose, even though, as you point out, the blast radius and the damage and things like that is less than the traditional nuclear weapons. It becomes harder for states to distinguish between conventional weapons and tactical nuclear weapens.
Exactly. I'm glad you pointed that out, and I'm glad you're speaking for the record on this, because we share your concern here at the Mendocino Environmental Center as well with these weapons. Do we know how precise these weapons are? The Army has a weapon called the long-range precision fire weapons, and they're usually staged right alongside of the ATA CMS missiles. Do we know how precise they are? I mean, in other words, if Trump wanted to take out just North Korea's nuclear test facility, like say within a 5 to 10 mile radius, are they that precise, or are we being misled as to how precise they are?
I don't know how relevant that is. So let's assume they're perfectly precise. I interviewed Congressman Ted Lieu about this recently, who, he was based in Pacific Command. He was in Guam. He knows exactly these kind of issues. He's an expert on, the entire Pacific region and knows a lot about North Korea. He says even if we were to hit exactly where we need to hit, we don't know where their nuclear facilities are.
Okay.
And if you miss a facility, they're going to come back with it. They very well could come back with it.
Right.
So it's even more a question of intelligence. Do we have the human intelligence to know where every single military facility is? Because when you go for the king, you can't miss. If you're going to hit, I'm not saying we should. I'm against that.
Right.
But just saying if we did, and you miss one of them, he could launch that at Seoul. He could launch that at Japan.
Right.
So you would have to somehow know, and I don't think it doesn't matter how good your intelligence service is. I don't think it's reasonable to think that we would know. Kim's own regime probably doesn't know where they all are, other than the man at the top himself. So even if they have perfect accuracy, first of all, how do we know that we hit them all? Second of all, if they have something underground that we can't even touch with these weapons, that's a whole other question. Say they have it far enough in a cave that our weapon can't even destroy it.
Right.
So, for that reason, I think it's kind of a sick pipe dream to think that you can just knock them all out, and then because you miss one, and then you're in big trouble.
Yeah. Almost none of this intelligence, of course, is shared with the American public, I wish some of it would be, particularly with Congress. Excuse me. And you can do that in closed-door sessions of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee. These could be, classified hearings and closed hearings. Do we know whether that's being done at all with regard to North Korea? Where, what intelligence we have, where the nuclear ordnance might be stored, and also, whether in fact we have a war games book for North Korea, to the extent that that war games scenarios were developed for the Soviet Union and China, back in the Cold War days. Do we really have a war games book?
Well, I know we did under the Clinton administration. What they found was that they had chilling estimates of what would happen. I mean, Clinton originally was considering a military option, and then after the Defense Department sort of released their internal estimates of what would happen, they estimated over 1 million people would die, and then Clinton just realized this isn't the path we want to go down. I don't know if we've conducted estimates like that since, but when I talked to Congressman Lieu, if I recall correctly, he said that we just have very poor intelligence about North Korea. I mean, it's a question if we'd know where all the nuclear facilities, if we had great intelligence, and we have very poor intelligence.
Right.
So the whole thing seems like a non-starter, and frankly, I think it's pretty frightening and maybe even insane that Trump is even considering this.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
What about the October 15th deadline to recertify Iran? Do you have any specific documents or information about how this has evolved and what dangers might lurk if he does not recertify?
If he doesn't recertify, I don't see any reason for them not to pursue acquiring a nuclear weapon, and I think that would be extremely dangerous, not because I think Iran is uniquely aggressive, despite what think tanks and things here say, here in the U.S. or in Washington say, but because the region is just extremely unstable. It's volatile, and I think we should want to have a general nuclear weapons free zone in the entire in any region that's extremely volatile, including Israel, incidentally. But Iran is of course in the region too. So if he decertifies, they have no reason. I don't want there to be more nuclear weapons in that region, but they'd be crazy not to pursue it, I think. So there's that danger. I guess the one thing preventing it is that European firms are conducting a lot of business. It's basically an untapped market, Iran, because of the sanctions and kind of the diplomatic freeze on them since the revolution. A lot of businesses are finding that there's a lot of money there. And so that makes it difficult for the U.S., when there's very powerful corporations and things that want to do business there. That's sort of a check on the U.S. from failing to recertify it. However, I wouldn't say that by any means stops the U.S., especially Donald Trump, who we all know is very unpredictable.
Right. John, you had a question?
Yes, Ken, this is John again, speaking from Falls Church. I can't talk about it because we actually a subcontractor in this area, but you can talk about it because you're an investigative journalist and there's no similar secrecy oath or gag order imposed on you. Tell our audience, tell our audience how the United States Department of the Treasury and the State Department locate the assets of a country like Iran, how they go about locating these assets, seizing these assets, and even filing asset forfeiture on proceedings on these assets as a punitive measure or as an embargo measure for developing a nuclear weapons program, in the same way that Trump last week said that we would now cooperate with China in doing the same with banking relationships and trading relationships with North Korea. Exactly. What is the plan? How do they do that? How much money was returned to Iran by Obama? How did we get our hands on that money? Just paint the picture for us.
Unfortunately, it's funny. It's funny you mention that. I just filed a FOIA request to see what with the Treasury to see what the list of firms in North Korea were that are targeted, because no one ever talks about these things. I mean, when we're talking about cutting off, a critical lifeline for a country, we should probably make sure that this isn't going to be places that people rely on for food and things, but we don't know. Nobody ever reports it. So that's something I'm pursuing. With respect to Iran, I don't know, but one thing I can tell you is that, let's see, there have been some firms caught doing business there where they shouldn't have because it's just extremely profitable. And then another issue is that the effect you often have when you do sanctions, maybe the intent is to try to hurt the regime. It very often strengthens the regime.
What do you mean? How so?
The people internally are in a more precarious situation, and they sort of rally around the leader to protect them.
Oh, okay.
So often it'll have a sort of paradoxical effect, and you see that again. And you saw that in Iraq. It strengthened Saddam, and hurt a lot of the population in terms of food and medicine access and things like that. So I think Trump may really be misunderstanding what the consequences of that would be. I think it would really prop up the regime.
So let's just follow up on that for a second. So we know that Obama returned about $100 billion to Iran. Is that correct?
I think that's correct, yeah.
Okay. So what was in those assets? What do we know about those assets?
I just don't know much about that subject. Perhaps you could share with us if you're aware.
Well, let's. Okay, I know a little something about that. So I don't know what I can say. That's not classified. It's about $100 billion. I can tell you that for sure. I can say that some of those assets were right here in the United States. That at least $8 billion of those assets were here in New York City money center banks. We know that for certain. And again, there are any number of contractors that look for that money as well. We know that that money was also in 6 other countries, including Switzerland. We know that that former Iranian Chamber of Congress head Akanaki Kamushi was quoted in the semi-official FARS agency as saying the Obama administration had allowed that $8 billion to be kept in the United States up until the time that Washington froze those dollars in Iranian assets in the wake of the 1979 Islamic Resolution and captured 52 American hostages. So we know it goes back to that time. As far as the graduated unfreezing of Iranian overseas assets without rescinding the sanctions themselves, we know that President Obama had the capacity to respond to offers made by Iran in the course of negotiations without doing years-long efforts to put existing sanctions regime in place. And we know that from a unnamed senior official within the Obama administration itself. I think we know that that approximately $1.5 billion came from imports of gold and other precious metals, petrochemical exports, and Iran's auto sector, and that they were disguised by money laundering operations within that country as quote-unquote humanitarian transactions. And we know that the core sanctions architecture remained firmly in place as long as 6 months after Obama said that the assets would be unfrozen with respect to oil and financial services. And John Kerry, no better source than former Secretary of State John Kerry made that declaration. And as soon as he did, his feet were put to the fire, and he had to release another $25 billion in lost oil revenues over the next 6 months. So that much I can tell you unequivocally and absolutely, and this is all unclassified.
Wow.
It's a lot.
Maybe we should be working together.
Yeah, right.
You brought up excuse me, Ken. You brought up Saudi Arabia.
Oh yeah, that's another one of my favorite topics.
Yeah,
Get me started on Saudi Arabia.
It is mine too, because there's so much that we are doing with them. I'm curious to know if you have uncovered either emails or documents from any federal intelligence agency that is of note that you'd like to share with our listeners that the listeners might not be aware of, and or Israel for that matter.
So with respect to Saudi Arabia, this is extremely interesting. I, am very interested in it just like you guys, and so I've targeted a bunch of different FOIA requests, both at the state level, for Saudi officials coming here, and then at the federal level too, FBI, DOD, things like that. And what's interesting is these are, I don't know for sure why, I can only speculate, but these are some of the most difficult targets to get documents back about, and probably for a single subject, this has probably been one that I've received documents redacted and withheld the most under national security exemptions out of any subject I've ever tried to pursue.
Which particular exemption have they thrown back at you?
I believe it's called B9. That's the national
B9.
security exemption. It's very vague. They just say that it's going to hurt the national security and interests.
And it's all relating to...
but they don't say why.
And it's all relating to Saudi Arabia, I bet, right?
Yep, exactly. This just happens again. Obviously, this happens with lots of different subjects, but for Saudi Arabia, it's the highest incidence of anything I've ever experienced, and I file a lot of requests, so that's quite something.
So let me jump in here on I think, which is something that I'm a former Marine, so duty on our country looms large in my moral universe, and as an American, as a former Marine, as a contractor who does a lot in the area of financial intelligence, I am embarrassed to call myself an American, especially when I'm traveling in the Middle East, when it comes to something that you reported on, and that is, did the United States assist in the disastrous bombing of a funeral in Yemen some while back that resulted in 140 people being killed and as many as 600 being injured? And this was a bombing that the United States intelligence community directly assisted the Saudi-led coalition and Air Force in the bombing of a funeral in Sada, Yemen, again killing 140 unarmed civilians and injuring another 600. A renowned combat engineer and former Pentagon official by the name of Pierre Spray says that evidence suggests that the United States did exactly that. Do you want to report on that for our listeners today?
Yeah, well, Spray was an interesting voice because he basically, him and along with a few other engineers, they essentially invented the F-16, which is kind of, I know a lot of the people in the Air Force, this is many people's sort of pride and joy in the U.S. Air Force. So I would think he would know something about, air operations, which the airstrike, of course, was. And what he says is they simply wouldn't have had the gas to launch from where they did within, I can't remember which city it was within Saudi Arabia, right, without being refueled. And the only, to my knowledge, state actor with refueling capabilities that could have done that, I believe, was, if I remember correctly, it was either the U.S. or the U.S. and the U.K. So what that means is that we would have had to refuel this plane, which was just, this is like a textbook definition of a war crime, is right, hitting funeral attendees, right, largely civilians. And what this was, this was a triple tap airstrike. First of all, you hit people the first time, and then the funeral happens, you hit them, and then the second funeral happens, and you hit them.
Right.
So, I mean, it's just like you say, you know, I like a lot about the country, but that was just, I was embarrassed. I mean, it's just disgusting that would even be considered. Moreover, that as it appears that we would, I mean, certainly we're already providing intelligence and logistical support for Saudi Arabia in this war against what's really the poorest country in the entire region, the richest country, Saudi, against the poorest country, Yemen. Mm-hmm. But to do that to, you know, funeral attendees, that's just, I can't believe that.
And also to humanitarian aid workers.
Right.
I mean, right. You know, this is a tactic that's common to terrorists. Set off one bomb, wait for the first responders to show up, and then set off the bigger bomb.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and here the United States is literally a co-conspirator with Saudi Arabia in committing the very crimes that we accuse terrorists of. I mean, am I crazy, or is this the case? I mean,
no, that's exactly the case, and I think internationally everyone saw it that way, except in perhaps the United States and maybe Israel.
Yeah. So
and Saudi Arabia, of course.
So
the belligerent in this conflict.
So the devil is in the details. So run that by our audience one more time. So what was the nearest Saudi base to this target, and why would U.S. Air Force tankers had to refuel these Saudi jets mid-flight?
Well, we already know that we routinely refuel them. There has been, you know, the Defense Department has copped to that, and they've even told us how much gas they provided refuels. Because very often the planes, they can only fly a certain distance, and so mid-air, I don't know if you're of course the military, so you know what these are like, but just to explain to listeners, it's basically a giant flying bus, and it has sort of like a fuel nozzle, and then, so midway, while one of these planes, maybe an F-16 or an F-15, they'll be flying, the nozzle will sort of attached to it, it'll refill their gas so they don't need to land since, you know, they're still over Yemen. And then that giant bus, which has a ton of fuel, will go and, you know, fly back to the landing strip or wherever it is. And that enables the plane to go far enough to conduct a, you know, long range, operation that they just wouldn't have the gas to do. I'm looking at a map right now. I can't remember which air base it was out of, but according to Spray,
I don't want to lead the witness, but it starts with an R.
Oh, was this Riyadh?
Yes.
Okay, so Spray, again, who was, you know, a very celebrated engineer, oversaw a lot of breakthroughs in the development of airplanes and kind of moving towards these more agile fighters that again USAF seem to have a lot of affection for. He just explained the carrying capacity of the weight, and he kind of even assumed, he said, even if it has the lightest possible weight, which of course it wouldn't because they'd be carrying a payload of bombs to drop, they still wouldn't be able to make it that far without a refuel. And then the question is, well, who has the capability to refuel? Because Saudi Arabia doesn't have, they don't have these ships.
Right.
So it appears as though, I mean, this isn't ironclad proof, but I don't see how they could have made it there without a refuel, and who that would have come from other than us.
All right, so that's war crime allegation number one. And incidentally, I've been a participant in not just in United Nations peacekeeping missions, but also in United Nations observer missions and in true supervision missions. So I know a little something about this. So I know a little something about war crimes. So here we have war crime allegation number one, that the United States refueled the Saudi jets with its own tankers. War crime allegation number two, the Mark 82 bombs that were allegedly dropped on this funeral. Explain to our audience what a Mark 82 bomb is, and how do we suspect that illegal ordnance was used on the civilian population?
Well, if I remember correctly, those are cluster bombs, which are banned under various international agreements, because it's just the very nature of these weapons is just indiscriminate.
Right.
I mean, the idea of war is that you have to at least be trying to target civilians or fighters, and not civilians. I mean, obviously mistakes can happen and things like that, but the intent has to be there. Now, when you have a munition like this that you drop and it just explodes in a rain, it's almost like a giant nail bomb or something. There's no way you're going to be able to target that in any sort of meaningful way. So, for that reason, international law, I don't know if it's enshrined in international law, but I think we're either a treaty member, or pretty much every other country is, for not using these. And I think the U.S. had claimed to have cut the Saudis off of these weapons because it was so controversial and the international community was so upset about it. However, we end up using it, and when you use these things, I mean, people just don't understand. This isn't like in the movies where you have, like a targeted bomb, it's got a laser or something, and then you hit. This, everything afterwards looks like ground beef afterwards, I've heard.
Exactly.
It's just, there's meat everywhere, and there's no way you can, how do you ensure that you're targeting, military targets if it just annihilates everything in this entire radius,
Right. Exactly. And of course, that's one of the favorite weapons, along with white phosphorus, that's used by Israel in Gaza. And we can get to Israel in a second. But before we leave allegation number 2 about the U.S.-Saudi war crimes at this funeral in Yemen, we had the executive director of the Human Rights Watch Group, Ken Roth, do his own investigation of the use of this Mark 82 bomb at this funeral in Yemen. And why don't you tell our audience what he found?
I think he found that this was an American dropped ordinance, which again is in violation of these treaties against their use, which I have to say I think are perfectly reasonable. I mean, I don't think any civilized society should be using these kinds of weapons. And that's noteworthy because, Human Rights Watch, if anything, there's criticism of them going too easy on Western governments in general, and the United States in particular. So for, a respected and very, frankly, conservative rights group like that to issue a statement like that, I think you can be pretty sure that it was an American armament.
Right. In fact, they had photo evidence. They had other documentary evidence that the bomb was used, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Well, following this war crime, this alleged war crime, the UN Secretary General called for an independent investigation into rights abuses and other war crimes in Yemen. What has become of the UN Secretary General's call for this investigation?
Well, one of the problems with the UN is that not all member states are equal, in the sense that there are some very powerful ones. You see that in how they drafted the Security Council. They basically give these ascendant powers and votes to the most powerful states, which I don't think was entirely unreasonable because you want to, they have nuclear weapons and you want to ensure that their needs are attended to prevent the worst from happening. However, that creates a lot of problems, and one of the problems is that these powerful member states, of which the U.S. is the most powerful, can sort of lean on the various UN institutions, sometimes even going as far as saying, we're going to cut off funding to the UN if you don't do what we want you to do. So in these cases, there's never really such a thing as a wholly independent inquiry. I'm not saying we shouldn't strive for that as an ideal, but they're always going to be under enormous pressure, not just from the U.S., but from Western powers in general to kind of not go too hard on them. And so that can really limit the extent to which independent probes, things like that, can really investigate things closely.
We mentioned, and we're running out of time, Ken, so we're going to have to wrap it up, but we'd love to have you back. We mentioned the use of U.S. weapons by Israel to kill in Gaza. Give us a 1-minute summary, if you will, about that. And again, I want to remind my audience that I've been part of a UN observer mission in Gaza, and we came to our own conclusions. But why don't you tell us what you know, Ken?
Well, we know that, every operation, there's the most recent major operation, I can't remember what it was called, maybe Cast Lead, I can't remember the name of it. They killed something like 8 times as many civilians as Hamas militants. So, I mean, obviously, war is messy, war is by nature, entails lots of civilian deaths, if we're honest. However, to kill, an order of magnitude greater civilians and militants, that just, I think that's really disgraceful. And that's what happens again and again. And I should say that very often these operations are justified as, Hamas launched a rocket or something, which obviously they shouldn't be doing. They shouldn't be launching rockets at civilians. However, if you compare the death toll, there's just no comparison. The civilians that Hamas kills in Israel are indetectable compared to those killed in these largely air operations.
Yeah,
over Gaza.
And in fact, in one war crime that in which I was part of the a party of investigators, at least 30 dead and wounded back in July of 2014 at Gaza's main hospital. Again, we found that U.S. weapons were used by Israel to bomb this hospital and to kill these people. And I recommend, along with your own work, your own fine work, I recommend the work of Josh Rubner. He's the author of Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace. And he is the policy director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. Highly recommend his work as an investigative journalist, as well as your own, Ken Klippenstein. Tell us how our listeners can support you and your work and that of the work of the organizations you work with.
Oh, sure. Well, as a freelancer, I write for a bunch of different places, but kind of the focal point where I post all my stuff and you can see what I'm working on and kind of just commentary in general. You can go to my Twitter page. It's at Ken Klippenstein, K-E-N, last name spelled K-L-I-P-P-E-N, S-T-E-I-N. Probably not too many other Ken Klippensteins, I presume. And that's really where I post all my different stuff, so that I don't have to run through the list of all the different publications I write for. But then Shatterproof, as you guys have pointed out, is where I have this ongoing repository of government documents that you can go through yourself, and so you don't have to take me at my word about my conclusions, and you can look at them and see what you think of them. That's shadowproof.com, and if you like it, you can become a subscriber there, which helps them out a great deal. And
that permits people to have two-way discussion with you. Is it sort of like a membership, or how does that work?
Oh yeah. You can post. My Twitter account, email's up there. If anyone has any questions or even needs help with open records, I'm every day I'm helping other reporters and activists learn how to use FOIA, which at times can be a Byzantine and kind of bureaucratic tool. But once you pass that learning curve, I think people find it's really helpful. So feel free to reach out to me.
I'm just curious, before we say goodbye, if there's one, if there's a pattern that you'd seen as you collect this data, if you find one federal agency or entity more egregious than others, if you would just briefly note that to our listeners.
Oh, I would say the CIA, among kind of open records nerds, CIA is pretty widely regarded as thinking it's above the law and being very transparent.
Mel Goodman is a good friend of the station and a good friend of ours, and of course he wrote a wonderful book about his experience as a whistleblower in the United States, and I think he would agree as well, after a 27-year career in the CIA, that they've become paramilitarized, that they are at the tip of the spear, that they act often as mercenaries. If the U.S. military can't execute an order because it's unlawful, well, then they hire the CIA, its own in-house paramilitary experts and technical advisors and sharpshooters and death squads, or they just contract that out. Ken, we're Americans here. I'm often embarrassed to call myself an American in the Middle East. I'm also embarrassed to call myself a Jew. But that said, these are the high holy days. It's Rosh Hashanah. I wish you a Happy New Year, and you're in our prayers as you conduct your important work.
Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it. Really nice talking to you.
You bet. So we have been speaking with Ken Klippenstein, and this has been a show about national security matters and the Freedom of Information Act. The show will be archived at the KMEC website and then downloaded, edited, and uploaded to both our Facebook page and our YouTube link. That is Heroes and Patriots KMEC Radio, Mendocino Environmental Center. So I'm going to close out the show by thanking John, who's in Falls Church, Virginia. Thank you, John. Long distance.
Thank you for going the extra mile and making the effort to connect me to this important show.
And thanks to our 4 underwriters, that's Dr. Richard Phillips, Dunlap Roofing, Fry Vineyards and Winery, and Ore Hot Springs. We could not produce the show without their assistance. Thank you all for tuning in. We will be back with you next week with another show about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. My name is Mary Massey, along with John Goodiron. We thank you for tuning in and look forward to your returning with us. Thank you.
Happy New Year to all listeners.